It's the middle of July 2026, and something happened in the Strait of Hormuz this past weekend that deserves more than a passing headline. On the night of July 12th, United States Central Command carried out its fourth consecutive wave of strikes against Iranian military targets since a shaky ceasefire collapsed earlier in the month. Fighter jets flew, cruise missiles flew. Suppression of enemy air defense missions took out radar sites and surface-to-air batteries along the coast. All of that is, by now, a familiar rhythm in this conflict. But buried inside that fourth wave was something that had never happened before in the history of the United States military: the combat use of one-way attack sea drones. 3 Saronic Corsair unmanned surface vessels approached a pier at the Bandar Abbas naval base, the same sprawling facility Iran uses to house its submarine and fast attack boat fleet near the mouth of the strait. CENTCOM's own footage shows the boats making a slow, almost unhurried approach toward a gantry, holding what appears to be a Ghadir-class midget submarine, before each one detonates in sequence. No sailors on board, no pilot in a cockpit somewhere over the horizon, just a machine built for exactly one job, sent in to do it and destroyed in the process. CENTCOM said the strike degraded Iran's ability to keep threatening commercial shipping through the strait, and Iran's Ministry of Defense claimed it managed to intercept and destroy an American drone in the same area with a ground-to-air missile system. Both of those things can be true at once. Warfare like this rarely produces a clean, undisputed scoreboard, and it's worth being honest about that from the outset, rather than repeating whichever claim sounds more satisfying. So let's talk about how we got here, because the sea drone strike didn't happen in a vacuum. It's the product of a specific chain of events that go back to an agreement that fell apart almost as soon as it was signed. Earlier this year, after a period of intense fighting between the United States, Israel, and Iran, a memorandum of understanding was floated that would have effectively de-escalated the situation. Iran's parliamentary leadership initially signaled they'd accept it, then walked that back within days. The sticking point was the Strait of Hormuz itself, a waterway barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil and a significant share of its liquefied natural gas physically has to pass. Iran's interpretation of ensuring safe passage turned out to mean something very different from what Washington and its Gulf partners understood the phrase to mean. Iranian officials suggested that ships needed to coordinate transit routes with Tehran, and in practice, coordination looked like Shahed drone strikes on tankers and container ships that didn't comply, including attacks that killed mariners on board vessels with no military purpose whatsoever. When Iran struck a Cyprus-flagged container ship in the strait, President Trump publicly declared the ceasefire over, and the strikes that followed escalated in scale and sophistication each night. That's the immediate backdrop for why an American commander, sometime in the days before July 12th, decided this was the moment to bring an entirely new tool into an active shooting war, rather than keep it in reserve. And I think that decision is worth sitting with for a second, because it tells you something about where naval warfare is heading, not just in the Persian Gulf, but everywhere. It's also worth putting this particular flashpoint in a longer historical frame, because the Strait of Hormuz has been a pressure point in U.S.-Iran relations for close to 50 years, not just this year. Iran has threatened to close the strait, in one form or another, during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, during periods of heightened tension in the 2000s and 2010s over its nuclear program, and repeatedly during past sanctions campaigns from Washington. What's different this time isn't the threat itself, which Tehran has made and walked back so many times that regional analysts have practically stopped treating it as news on its own. What's different is that this time, the threat has come alongside actual attacks on actual commercial vessels. Real ships with real crews, not just naval posturing or seized tankers held for leverage the way Iran has done in the past. Killing a mariner aboard a merchant vessel by flying a Shahed drone into an engine room is a categorically different act than boarding and detaining a ship, which is itself already a serious violation of freedom of navigation, but stops well short of taking a life. That distinction is a big part of why the American response escalated as quickly and as visibly as it did, and why the political appetite in Washington for a harder line found so little resistance even among voices that have historically been skeptical of further entanglement in the Middle East. It's also worth remembering why this particular choke point carries so much weight in the first place. Roughly a fifth of the world's total oil consumption and a substantial share of global liquefied natural gas exports move through a channel that, at its narrowest usable shipping lanes, is only a couple of miles wide in each direction. Every major oil-producing state on the Arabian side of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, has effectively no alternative route for the overwhelming majority of its exports. Iran itself depends on the strait just as much, since a huge share of its own oil revenue, sanctioned and unsanctioned alike, moves through the same waterway. That mutual dependence is exactly why, historically, actually closing the strait for any extended period has always been more of a rhetorical weapon than a realistic Iranian policy option. Doing so would be an act of economic self-harm nearly as severe as the harm it inflicts on everyone else. What makes the current moment more dangerous than previous rounds of saber-rattling is that Iran appears to be testing a middle path, not closing the strait outright, but trying to impose a kind of informal toll and inspection regime on ships that pass through it, enforced through the threat and occasional use of force against vessels that don't comply. That's a genuinely novel form of pressure, distinct from a blockade, and it's part of why the U.S. response has focused so heavily on eliminating the specific military assets, radar sites, patrol boats, coastal missile batteries, that would let Iran actually enforce such a regime. Here's the thing about the Strait of Hormuz that makes it different from almost any other body of water on Earth. It's not just narrow, it's shallow, cluttered with islands, and historically, it has been Iran's home turf in a very literal sense. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy doesn't try to fight the United States Navy ship for ship because it can't. Instead, it built what analysts have long called a mosquito fleet. Dozens and dozens of small, cheap, fast attack craft, many of them armed with anti-ship missiles or rigged as suicide boats, designed to swarm a larger vessel from multiple directions at once and overwhelm its point defense systems through sheer numbers. That doctrine works, in theory, against a handful of expensive warships. It doesn't work nearly as well against another swarm. That's effectively what the Corsair represents. It's a low-cost, expendable, uncrewed surface vessel, originally developed for mine countermeasure work and now adapted for one-way strike missions. Task Force 59, the Navy's unmanned systems task force operating in the Gulf, has been fielding these platforms since earlier this year, specifically to test how uncrewed systems perform in a contested maritime environment. The Navy picked Saronic as one of several companies competing for a larger unmanned surface vessel program, and the Corsair had already been operating in the Strait in a support role before it was used in an actual strike. What changed on July 12th is that it stopped being a reconnaissance and support tool and became a weapon in its own right, sent directly at a hardened naval facility instead of held back as insurance. It's worth spending a moment on Task Force 59 itself, because it didn't appear out of nowhere for this strike. The unit was stood up specifically to experiment with unmanned and AI-enabled maritime systems in the Gulf, testing everything from solar-powered surveillance buoys to autonomous surface vessels, largely because the Navy recognized years ago that the Fifth Fleet's area of responsibility, the Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb further south, is exactly the kind of narrow, congested, high-traffic environment where a large crewed warship is both an expensive asset to risk and a relatively easy target to identify and track. The Corsair wasn't rushed into service as a wartime improvisation. It had already been logging real-world hours in a support and reconnaissance role, feeding data back to human operators and helping build a picture of the maritime environment around the strait. The step from that supporting role to being used as a strike weapon is actually a fairly natural extension once you've already built the platform, integrated it into the fleet's command structure, and confirmed it can operate reliably in those waters. 6 manufacturers, according to Defense Trade Reporting, have been evaluated for larger contracts in this space, which tells you this isn't a one-off gadget bought for a single mission, but the leading edge of a program the Navy intends to scale. If that sounds familiar, it should, because it's almost a direct copy of what's been happening in the Black Sea for the past 3 years. Ukraine, a country with essentially no traditional navy left after Russia's initial invasion, built a fleet of naval drones like the Magura and the newer Sargon 3000, and used them to systematically hunt down and destroy or damage a meaningful fraction of Russia's Black Sea fleet, including warships that once would have been considered untouchable. In fact, in the same week as the Bandar Abbas strike, Ukraine's navy sank a Russian FSB patrol ship called the Izumrud near Novorossiysk, using exactly this kind of unmanned strike boat, and Ukrainian forces have been hitting dozens of Russian vessels a week in the Sea of Azov and Black Sea as part of a broader campaign against Moscow's sanctioned shadow fleet. Ukraine effectively proved the concept. A country or a force with a fraction of the naval budget of its opponent can neutralize much larger, much more expensive vessels using cheap, autonomous, expendable systems, provided it's willing to trade the drone for the outcome. The United States watched that play out for 3 years and has now, for the first time, put the same basic idea into practice against Iran. The scale of what Ukraine has managed to pull off is genuinely worth dwelling on for a moment, because it's easy to lose the significance of it inside a single headline. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, commanded publicly by a figure who goes by the call sign Madyar, have reported striking dozens of Russian vessels in the span of just a few days on multiple separate occasions this month, most of them tankers belonging to what's commonly called Russia's shadow fleet, the aging, often uninsured ships Moscow uses to keep exporting sanctioned oil and to resupply occupied territory. Independent open-source analysis has estimated Ukraine struck something like a quarter or more of the entire Russian vessel population operating in the Sea of Azov within a span of just 4 days. That's not a symbolic strike here or there. That's closer to a sustained campaign of attrition against an entire category of maritime infrastructure, carried out by a country that, at the start of the full-scale invasion, had almost no navy left to speak of after losing its flagship and much of its surface fleet in the war's opening phase. The same unmanned systems that let Ukraine punch so far above its weight against Russia's Black Sea fleet, including the sinking of the cruiser Moskva earlier in the war, and just this past week, an FSB patrol ship called the Izumrud near a Russian resort town not far from a property long alleged to be linked to President Putin, are conceptually the same family of technology now being fielded by the United States against Iran. The lineage is direct. A smaller power demonstrates that autonomous strike boats can neutralize a much larger conventional navy in confined waters, and a much larger power with vastly more resources takes note and builds its own, better-funded version of the same idea. The cost math here is genuinely staggering when you line it up. A single Corsair-style unmanned surface vessel costs a small fraction of what a crude patrol boat costs to build, and nothing at all in terms of a human life if it's lost in the attempt. Iran's larger fast attack craft, especially anything approaching the size of what was docked at Bandar Abbas, can run into the millions of dollars. And losing a submarine or a maintenance facility that supports one is a strategic setback measured in years, not weeks. When you can trade a machine worth a rounding error against Iran's overall replaces easily fast attack fleet for a strike on a facility that took years to build, that arithmetic favors the attacker every single time. It's the same logic that's driven the drone revolution in Ukraine, just applied by a state with vastly more resources and a much more sophisticated industrial base to draw from. There's also an aerial component to this that's worth walking through because the sea drones didn't operate alone. CENTCOM's strike package on July 12th combined crewed fighter aircraft, F-18s off a carrier, and F-35s and F-16s configured for the Wild Weasel suppression of enemy air defenses role with one-way attack aerial drones flying alongside them. Some reporting has pointed to low-cost uncrewed aerial systems, built domestically and explicitly designed to mirror the aerodynamic profile of Iran's own Shahed 136, the same delta-wing loitering munition Iran has both used directly and supplied to Russia for its long-range strikes on Ukrainian cities. There's a certain grim symmetry in an American analog of that same airframe, now being launched back at the country that designed it, at a fraction of the cost of a manned aircraft and without risking a pilot over some of the most heavily defended airspace in the region. The reason that matters strategically, beyond the obvious point about not risking American lives, is what it lets a joint force do with its more expensive and more limited assets. F-35s are exceptional at the specific job of penetrating contested airspace undetected and taking the first look at what's actually still active on enemy radar. But there are only so many of them in theater, and every sortie carries real risk and real cost. If cheap aerial and sea drones can absorb the job of degrading air defenses, drawing out radar emissions, so that the crewed suppression aircraft can identify and destroy those systems, and directly striking soft targets like patrol boats or maintenance facilities, then the stealth fighters and the carrier air wing get freed up to focus on the harder, higher value targets that actually require a human decision maker and precision guided munitions. That's the multi-domain targeting concept the Pentagon has been building toward for years. Uncrewed systems doing the dangerous, repetitive, expendable work, while manned platforms handle judgment calls and high-value strikes. What happened over the weekend looks like the first time that concept has actually been executed live, across sea and air together against a real adversary rather than in a training exercise. Now, it's worth being clear-eyed about the limits of all this, because there's a temptation in coverage of moments like this to treat precision weapons as a substitute for strategy, and they aren't. Air power and naval drones can degrade Iran's ability to threaten shipping in the Strait. They can destroy radar sites, patrol boats, coastal missile batteries, and command infrastructure. What they can't do, on their own, is force a change in the character of the Iranian government, or guarantee that Tehran won't rebuild these capabilities once the strikes stop, or resolve the underlying dispute over who gets to set the rules for transit through one of the most economically important waterways on the planet. Regime change, if that's ever a stated or unstated goal on either side, is a different and much larger undertaking that historically requires either an internal uprising with real staying power or ground presence, neither of which is currently part of the stated American strategy. What air and sea power actually deliver here is control of a specific, narrow, valuable piece of geography and the ability to make the cost of contesting that control extremely high for Iran in the near term. That's a real and significant achievement if it holds, but it's a tactical and operational one, not a settlement of the broader political conflict. President Trump's public comments over the weekend reflected that distinction, whether intentionally or not. Asked about Iran's claim that it had closed the strait, he dismissed the idea outright, saying American forces would essentially take over policing of the strait and that the United States would function as its guardian. He went further, suggesting the U.S. should be compensated for providing that security going forward, something along the lines of having guarded the waterway for free for decades and now expecting to be paid for the service. That's a notable rhetorical shift from the traditional American position, which has always framed freedom of navigation through international straits as a public good. The U.S. Navy underwrites because it benefits global trade and, by extension, the American economy, not as a service rendered for a fee. Whether that idea translates into any actual policy, some kind of transit fee or security arrangement with Gulf shipping interests, is very much an open question, and it's the kind of statement that's easy to make in a press availability and much harder to operationalize through actual international agreements, especially given how many countries and companies rely on that waterway and would have opinions about who gets to charge for its use. Iranian state media, for its part, responded with characteristically inflammatory rhetoric, running headlines invoking sudden death alongside images of the president and the late Senator Lindsey Graham, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps publicly declared the strait to be Iranian territory, a claim that has no real standing under the international law governing straits used for international navigation, which guarantees transit passage regardless of a coastal state's territorial waters claims. That's not a matter of opinion or spin. It's the settled interpretation under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, even though Iran itself has never ratified that convention and has periodically threatened closure of the strait going back decades without ever actually being able to make it stick for long, largely because doing so would also strangle its own oil exports and invite exactly the kind of overwhelming response we're now watching play out. Which brings us to Senator Graham, because his death over the weekend is genuinely part of this same news cycle, not a tangent tacked on for engagement. Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator from South Carolina, died Saturday night at 71, after what his office described as a brief and sudden illness. Preliminary findings from the medical examiner in Washington pointed to an aortic dissection tied to underlying heart disease. He had just returned from a trip to Ukraine days earlier. Graham was one of the most prominent hawkish voices in the Senate for more than 2 decades, first elected in 2002, and a close ally of President Trump in his second term despite a famously rocky relationship between the two men earlier on. He was, for years, one of the loudest advocates in Washington for a harder line against Iran, on the record as far back as 2010, arguing the United States needed to be willing to degrade the regime's capacity to wage war if diplomacy over its nuclear program failed. In the weeks before this current conflict began, he was reportedly among those privately and publicly pushing the administration toward the strikes that eventually happened, telling reporters in Tel Aviv in February that the United States was on the verge of eliminating what he called the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the region. He was also a fixture of American support for Ukraine throughout that country's war with Russia, making repeated trips to Kiev and pressing colleagues in both parties to keep military aid flowing, and he had just returned from another such trip to Ukraine only days before he died. His personal story is worth a beat of its own context, separate from the foreign policy record. Graham grew up in central South Carolina, living with his family behind a liquor store, restaurant, and pool hall his parents ran. Both of his parents died while he was still a young man, and he became the primary caretaker for his younger sister, whom he later legally adopted. That biography, a small-town South Carolina kid who became one of the most recognizable foreign policy hawks in modern American politics, is part of why tributes came in as broadly as they did this week from allies and frequent critics alike. Tributes came in from across the political spectrum, including from the president, who said he'd spoken with Graham by phone just hours before his death, and that nothing about that conversation suggested anything was wrong. It's a genuinely significant loss for a Senate that will now be without one of its most experienced foreign policy voices in the middle of an active, unresolved conflict he spent years pushing for a tougher posture on. And it leaves an open question about who, if anyone, steps into that particular role as one of the loudest congressional voices shaping how far the United States is willing to go in the Gulf. Stepping back out to the wider picture, there's a broader pattern worth naming here, because it isn't limited to the Gulf. What we watched happen at Bandar Abbas over the weekend, and what's been happening in the Black Sea for the better part of 3 years, are really the same story told twice. Autonomous, low-cost, one-way systems are becoming the default tool for degrading an adversary's naval capacity in contested, narrow waters, whether that adversary is Russia's Black Sea fleet or Iran's fast attack fleet in the Gulf. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces have reportedly struck dozens of Russian-flagged vessels in a matter of days on multiple occasions this month alone, mostly targeting the tankers Russia relies on to move sanctioned oil in what's often called its shadow fleet, alongside patrol ships and support vessels. The scale of that campaign has genuinely reshaped how analysts think about naval power in enclosed or semi-enclosed seas. You no longer need a blue water navy to impose real costs on a much larger conventional force. You need a domestic manufacturing base that can churn out expendable platforms faster than the other side can afford to lose the things those platforms are aimed at. That's a lesson with implications well beyond Ukraine and Iran, and it's one that navies around the world, including America's principal strategic competitors, are absorbing in real time. It's also worth touching on what all of this means for oil markets and the broader global economy, since that's ultimately the reason a conflict over a 21-mile wide waterway commands this much attention from governments and traders thousands of miles away. Every time tension in the strait spikes, energy markets brace for a supply shock, because even a partial temporary disruption to the roughly 20 million barrels a day that typically transit the strait would ripple through global oil prices almost immediately. So far, the pattern this year has been one of elevated risk premiums and volatility rather than a sustained supply crisis, in large part because the United States and its regional partners have made clear, through actions like this latest strike, that they intend to keep the waterway physically open rather than let Iran's disruption campaign succeed. That's precisely the strategic logic behind targeting Iran's naval and coastal strike capability so aggressively. It isn't really about punishing Tehran for its own sake. It's about removing the tools Iran would need to make good on any broader threat to actually choke off traffic through the strait for an extended period. Whether markets continue to treat this as a contained regional flare-up or start pricing in a more serious and prolonged disruption will depend heavily on whether attacks on commercial shipping continue or whether this latest wave of strikes actually succeeds in suppressing them. There's also a mystery sitting inside this week's timeline that hasn't been resolved and is worth acknowledging honestly, rather than glossing over. On July 10th, a separate round of airstrikes hit targets inside Iran after CENTCOM had already said it considered its previous wave of strikes for that period complete, and no country or force has claimed responsibility for them. Iran's parliament pointed fingers at the United Arab Emirates, suggesting Emirati territory or infrastructure had played some behind-the-scenes role, an accusation Tehran has leveled at various Gulf neighbors repeatedly over the past several months without producing public evidence. It's the kind of loose end that tends to get answered eventually, either through leaked intelligence assessments, satellite imagery analysis from open-source researchers, or eventually an official acknowledgement from whichever party was actually responsible. But as of now, it remains unattributed, and it's worth resisting the urge to fill that gap with speculation dressed up as certainty. So where does this actually leave things? In the immediate term, CENTCOM has said its objective with this latest wave of strikes, sea drones included, is narrowly framed. Degrade Iran's capacity to keep attacking commercial shipping, transiting the Strait of Hormuz, not seize Iranian territory, not topple the government, not occupy anything. Whether that narrow objective is achievable without triggering a much larger and more prolonged conflict depends on a few things that are genuinely uncertain right now. It depends on whether Iran's leadership calculates that continuing to contest the strait is worth the accelerating cost being imposed on its naval and air defense infrastructure, given that every wave of strikes so far has left it measurably weaker in exactly the capabilities it would need to make good on threats to close the waterway. It depends on whether the sea drone strikes prove to be a one-time demonstration of a new capability or the start of a sustained campaign, the way Ukraine's naval drone strikes evolved from occasional high-profile hits into a near-constant grinding pressure campaign against an entire class of vessels. And it depends on regional actors like Turkey, which has been positioning itself as a potential mediator and has already voiced concern about the war spilling further into shared waterways, and Gulf states that depend enormously on the strait staying open and are watching all of this with an obvious and understandable anxiety about where the escalation ladder leads next. There's a related question worth raising, too, about precedent and how other militaries around the world are likely reading this moment. Every time a major power demonstrates a new capability in live combat rather than a test environment, it changes the calculations of everyone else watching, allies and rivals alike. China's Navy, which has invested enormously in its own uncrewed surface and underwater systems and operates in its own set of contested and congested waters in the South China Sea and around Taiwan, will study this strike closely. So will Russia, which has been on the receiving end of exactly this kind of asymmetric maritime pressure from Ukraine for years, and now gets to see how a much better resourced military adapts and scales the same basic idea. And Gulf states themselves, many of which maintain their own smaller naval forces and have watched Iran's fast attack fleet as a persistent regional threat for decades, will be looking at whether they need to invest in similar low-cost uncrewed platforms of their own, both as a deterrent and as a way of reducing their dependence on American or Allied naval protection for their own coastal waters. None of that plays out on the news cycle of a single week, but it's very much part of the second-order significance of what happened at Bandar Abbas. There's also a harder, less comfortable question underneath all of this about where the line sits between degrading a military capability and crossing into something that starts to look like sustained open-ended war footing, even without a formal declaration of war from Congress. The strikes so far have been framed narrowly, aimed at specific military infrastructure tied directly to Iran's ability to threaten shipping, and CENTCOM's own public statements have been careful to describe the objective in exactly those terms, rather than anything broader. But 4 consecutive waves of strikes over the better part of 2 weeks, including the first ever combat use of an entirely new weapons category, is already a meaningfully different scale of engagement than a single retaliatory strike or limited response to a specific provocation. Whether Congress, the American public, and the international community continue to view this as a bounded, proportionate response to attacks on commercial shipping, or start to see it as a slow slide into a much larger and more open-ended conflict, is likely to become one of the central political questions in Washington over the coming weeks, especially with one of the Senate's most influential voices on exactly this question no longer in the room to shape that debate. What's genuinely new here and worth remembering after the headlines about this specific strike fade is the demonstration itself. The United States has now shown in a live combat environment, rather than a test range, that it can pair crude stealth aircraft, uncrewed aerial strike systems modeled on an adversary's own weapons, and one-way attack sea drones into a single coordinated strike package against a contested choke point. That's a capability with implications well beyond this particular conflict and this particular waterway. Whatever happens next in the Strait of Hormuz, whether it de-escalates through renewed negotiation, grinds on as a rolling campaign of strikes and counterstrikes, or spirals into something larger, the toolkit being used to fight it has visibly changed. And every Navy watching this unfold is taking careful notes on what a cheap, autonomous, expendable weapon can do against a much more expensive, much more entrenched target when the side deploying it has the industrial capacity and the political will to keep building more of them. That's the story underneath the story this week, and it's likely to matter for a lot longer than the current round of strikes does.